The final tap of the hammer was a sound so small it was swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky, yet it was the sound that cleaved Martha's life in two. It sealed the plain pine box that held her husband, and with him, the deed to the farm, the warmth of their bed, the future they had sketched out in quiet whispers after sundown. The preacher's words were dust on the wind. The neighbor's condolences were smooth, worn stones in her pocket, offering weight but no comfort. She stood alone as they shoveled the dry earth back into the ground, a golden retriever pressed against her leg, his panting the only living rhythm she could feel. Bo, her husband's dog, now hers. The transfer of loyalty was as swift and brutal as death itself. 2 days later, the man from the bank came, his boots leaving precise, apologetic prints in the dust of the yard. His papers were crisp, his voice a low monotone that sanded away the last of her hope. The debts were larger than the harvest, the farmer casualty of 2 seasons of failed rain. She did not weep. The well of her tears had run as dry as the creek bed. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on a crack in the whitewashed wall, a line that looked like a map to a place she couldn't go. She was given a week. She packed 1 trunk, a methodical ritual of folding and choosing. His wool coat, still smelling of hay and sweat. Her mother's tarnished silver locket. A sack of flour, a tin of coffee, a whetstone. Practical things. The rest, the handmade quilt, the rocking chair he'd built, the mismatched plates, was no longer hers. It belonged to the ledgers, to the numbers that had devoured their life. On the final morning, she walked through the empty rooms, her hand trailing over the cool, silent surfaces. Bo followed, his tail low, a shadow of her own grief. She locked the door, the click of the tumbler a final, percussive end. There was no one to see her leave. She was 22 years old, a widow, and she owned nothing but a dog, a trunk, and a useless parcel of land in the Barrens, a place her husband had called the Devil's Anvil, inherited from a disgraced uncle and never once visited. It was her only destination. It was exile. The journey was a descent. The rolling, grassy plains that had been her home flattened into a hardpan scabbed with saltbush and skeletal charla. The sun was a hammer beating down on the wagon's canvas cover, turning the air inside to a suffocating blanket. For 3 days, Martha drove the tired mule, her world shrinking to the animal's swaying haunches and the endless, shimmering horizon. Bo lay panting in the sliver of shade beside her, his soft brown eyes reflecting the bleached-out emptiness of the landscape. They were traveling away from water, away from life, into a geography of failure. The settlement, a miserable clutch of buildings named Providence in some act of profound irony, was their last stop for supplies. It was a place that felt temporary, as if it might give up and be scoured away by the next dust storm. She bought what she could afford, salted pork, beans, and a small bag of seed corn, an act of such blind, foolish hope it felt like a prayer. The land deed described the property as 5 acres bordering the limestone bluffs. When she finally found the marker, a pile of stones half buried in sand, her heart, a thing she thought had already withered to a knot, sank further. It was worse than she had imagined. There was no house, only the sunken, collapsed remains of a soddy, its roof a tangle of rotted timbers and dead roots. The earth was cracked and sterile, a mosaic of baked clay. And beyond the ruin, carved into the face of a low, sun-blasted cliff, was a dark opening. A cave. This was her inheritance. A hole in the ground. The mule brayed, a sound of protest and despair. Martha climbed down from the wagon, her boots sinking into the powdery dust. The heat radiated from the rock face in visible waves. She walked toward the cave mouth, Bo trotting nervously ahead, sniffing at the entrance before retreating to her side with a low whine. The air that breathed from the opening was cool, carrying a scent of damp stone and ancient stillness. It was a tomb. It was a shelter. It was all she had left. She stood there for a long time, a lone figure in a desolate landscape, the setting sun painting the bluffs in brutal shades of orange and red. It was a world without mercy, a place designed to break whatever was brought to it. It was resolve. It had to be. The first night was a reckoning with darkness. Not the familiar, comforting dark of a farmhouse, punctuated by the sigh of settling timbers or the distant call of a night bird, but a profound, absolute blackness that pressed in on all sides. Inside the cave, the last of the twilight was extinguished as if a door had been slammed shut on the world. The only light was the small, sputtering flame of a tallow candle, which cast their shadows, hers and Beau's, as monstrous, dancing things on the rough stone walls. The silence was a physical weight, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the steady drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the deeper recesses of the cavern. It was a sound that should have been comforting, a promise of life, but in the oppressive dark it sounded like a clock ticking down to some inevitable end. Fear, a cold and primal thing she had held at bay during the journey, began to seep into her bones. Every skittering sound from outside, the rustle of a pack rat, the lonely cry of a coyote, was magnified, transformed into a direct and personal threat. Beau, sensing her terror, moved closer, resting his heavy head on her lap. His warmth was a small anchor in the cold, indifferent stone. She ran her hand over his soft ears, the familiar texture a link to a life that was gone. She was in a grave. She had buried her husband and then she had buried herself. The despair was a tide, rising to fill her throat. She pulled her mother's locket from beneath her dress, the metal cool against her palm. She couldn't see it, but she could feel the familiar dent on its surface, and she clung to it as a drowning woman clings to a piece of wreckage. The hours stretched into an eternity. Sleep was impossible. She sat with her back against the cold wall, the dog in her lap, the candle burning down, and listened to the heart of the stone mountain. It was the sound of immense, geological time, a scale against which her own small, frantic life was meaningless. The world had forgotten her. She was a ghost haunting her own ruin. When the candle finally guttered out, plunging them into total blackness, she did not flinch. She had passed through the crucible of that first night. Something hard and unyielding had begun to form where the fear had been. Morning did not arrive, it seeped. A pale, grey luminescence crept into the mouth of the cave, slowly pushing back the absolute dark and revealing the nature of her refuge. The main chamber was larger than she'd realized, the ceiling arching high overhead, textured with the fossilized ghosts of ancient sea creatures. The air was cool and still. But it was two discoveries that stopped her, that arrested the slow, grinding machinery of her grief and replaced it with a spark of something else. The first was the source of the dripping. Following the sound, she moved deeper into the cave, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. In a smaller, connecting chamber, a fissure in the ceiling wept a steady, reliable stream of water which had collected over centuries in a deep, limestone basin. The water was clear and achingly cold. It was a miracle. A secret well, hidden from the desiccating sun. The second discovery was even more astonishing. In the main chamber, directly opposite the entrance, a section of the roof had collapsed long ago, creating a natural skylight, a circular opening to the sky some 30 feet up. And through this opening, a perfect, focused column of sunlight now poured, striking a patch of the cave floor. It was a spotlight on a stage. She walked into the beam of light, the warmth a shock after the chill of the deeper cave. She looked down. The floor here wasn't bare rock. It was a deep, rich deposit of soil, damp and dark, built from centuries of dust and animal droppings that had washed or fallen through the opening. She knelt, scooping up a handful. It was loam, cool and crumbly, smelling of earth and life. It was real soil. In this dead land, in this stone tomb, there was water, light, and earth. The three things necessary for a seed to grow. An idea, audacious and insane, took root in her mind. It was a flicker of defiance against the sun, against the drought, against the world that had cast her out. She looked at the bag of seed corn in her trunk, then back at the circle of sunlight on the cave floor. She could make a garden here. A secret garden, hidden from the hostile world. It was a mad thought. It was the only thought she had. The work became her world, a cycle of labor that pushed thought and sorrow aside. Her days were measured not by the sun's arc across the sky, but by the slow, deliberate traverse of the light beam across the cave floor. For 5 hours, from mid-morning to early afternoon, her hidden garden was illuminated, and in those 5 hours, she worked with a fierce, single-minded intensity. The first task was enriching the soil. Deeper in the cave system, in chambers where bats had roosted for millennia, she found thick deposits of guano. Using a rusted shovel head from the collapsed soddy, she dug it out, loading it into a canvas sack and dragging it back to the sunlit patch. The smell was sharp and ammoniac, filling the cavern, but to her it was the scent of possibility, of nitrogen and phosphates, the building blocks of life. She worked it into the loamy soil with her bare hands, feeling the texture change, becoming richer, more potent. Next was water. The dripping fissure was a blessing, but the pool was too far from the garden patch. She needed to move the water. Using fragments of shale broken from the cave walls, she constructed a painstaking, rudimentary aqueduct, a shallow, winding channel that snaked from the basin to her prepared plot. It was a maddening process. The stone shifted, the water seeped away, the grade was never quite right. For days, she did nothing but arrange and rearrange the flat stones, her knuckles raw, her back a knot of fire. Bo would watch her, a silent, patient observer, occasionally licking the sweat from her hand. Finally, one afternoon, she watched as the first trickle of clear, cold water completed its journey, darkening the soil at the edge of her garden. It was a victory as profound as any she had ever known. Then came the planting. She laid out the kernels of corn in neat, careful rows, pressing each one into the damp, dark earth with her thumb. It felt like an act of prayer, of burying a promise and trusting it to the darkness. She was a farmer of the underworld, tending a crop that would never feel the wind or see a full sky. Her muscles ached, her hands were calloused and permanently stained with dirt, but her mind was quiet. The rhythmic scrape of the shovel, the heft of the stones, the cool press of the soil, these were her liturgy. The cave was no longer a tomb, it was a machine she was building, a hidden engine of survival. After 2 months, her supplies had dwindled to a handful of beans and the last of the coffee. The journey to Providence was a necessity she dreaded. Leaving the cool, sheltered world of the cave felt like a kind of exposure, a peeling back of a protective skin. The heat and the glare of the sun were a physical assault. She walked the 12 miles, Bo trotting in her shadow, and the dust of the road caked her clothes and filled her lungs. The town looked just as grim and temporary as before, but now it was hunched under the full weight of the drought. The faces of the few people she saw were pinched with worry, their eyes scanning the mercilessly clear sky. She entered Gable's Mercantile, the bell above the door announcing her presence with a frail jangle. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust, dried goods, and quiet desperation. Mr. Gable stood behind the counter, a man whose posture seemed to have been permanently stooped by the weight of his ledgers. He nodded at her, his expression professionally neutral but tinged with a weary curiosity. It was Jedediah's voice that broke the silence, loud and laced with contempt. He was leaning against a barrel of pickles, a big man made bigger by his arrogance. "Well, look what the rock turned over," he drawled, not looking at her but at the other 2 men in the store. "Thought a coyote might have got you." Martha ignored him, placing her small list on the counter. "Flour. Salt. Lard." Mr. Gable began to measure out the flour. Jedediah pushed himself off the barrel and ambled closer. "Still living in that hole, woman? Scratching her at the walls like a badger." She kept her eyes on the counter, on the growing pile of white flour. "I need more seed corn," she said, her voice quiet but clear. A bark of laughter erupted from Jedediah. The other men chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Seed corn," he bellowed, slapping his thigh. "For what? You gonna plant it in the dust? Gonna pray for a flood in the desert?" Mr. Gable paused, his scoop hovering over the sack. He looked at her, a flicker of pity in his eyes. "Nothing's grown out here in 2 years." "It's a waste of coin, I'll have the seed," she repeated, her jaw tight. Her dignity was a thin, brittle shield, but it was all she had. She paid with the last of her coins, the metal clinking with grim finality on the wooden counter. As she gathered her meager supplies, Jedediah's parting shot followed her to the door. "Good luck, Grow-Win Rocks, little widow." The bell jangled again as she stepped back into the blinding sunlight, the laughter of the men a hot brand on her back. The walk back was a blur of shame and fury. Jedediah's mocking words echoed with the rhythm of her footsteps. "Good luck, Grow-Win Rocks." The humiliation was a physical thing, a bitter taste in her mouth. She felt the familiar tide of despair begin to rise, threatening to pull her under. She was a fool. Her secret garden was a pathetic fantasy, a child's game played in the dark while the real world starved. But when she finally reached the bluffs and stepped from the oppressive heat into the cool, silent sanctuary of the cave, the feeling shifted. The air was humid, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something new. A scent of green, living growth. She walked toward the sunlit patch, her heart pounding. And there they were. Dozens of them. Pale green shoots, no thicker than a piece of yarn, had pushed their way through the dark soil, uncurling toward the distant circle of light. They were fragile, ethereal, but they were alive. She dropped to her knees, touching a single, delicate leaf with the tip of her finger as if it might vanish. It was real. It was working. The mockery of the town, the scorn of that man, it all faded, becoming small and irrelevant in the face of this quiet, impossible miracle. Her resolve hardened, no longer brittle but forged into something new. This was her world. Its rules were different. The laughter of ignorant men could not reach this deep. Her life took on a new, monastic rhythm. Tending the shoots became her sole purpose. She weeded out the pale cave fungi that tried to compete for nutrients. She carefully monitored the flow of water from her shale aqueduct. She would sit for hours in the dim light, watching the plants, Bo resting his head on her knee. They grew strangely, adapted to their sheltered, sun-starved world. The stalks were paler than field corn, almost white in the dimness, and they grew tall and thin, straining for the light. But they were strong. As the weeks turned into a month, then 2, the world outside ceased to matter. The town of Providence, Mr. Gable, Jedediah, they were ghosts from another life. Her reality was the feel of the cool air, the sound of dripping water, the slow, steady miracle of growth in the heart of the stone. She was no longer just surviving. She was cultivating. She was creating a world within a world, a secret Eden born of darkness and stone. Outside the cave, the world was burning. The drought, once a hardship, had become a plague. The sun was a malevolent eye in a sky the color of brass. The earth cracked open in great, thirsty fissures. The creek beds were bone dry, their stones bleached white. From her vantage point at the cave mouth, Martha could see the air shimmer with heat, the distant landscape distorted and unreal. Dust storms, once occasional nuisances, were now a weekly torment. Great, rolling walls of brown dirt would blot out the sun, turning midday to a suffocating twilight. The wind would howl around the bluffs, a hungry, scouring force that stripped the land of its last vestiges of life. During these storms, she and Bo would retreat deep into the cave, the entrance covered with a heavy canvas sheet. They would listen to the muffled roar of the wind, safe in their stone fortress, the air inside still and humid with the exhalations of her hidden crop. The corn was thriving. The stalks were now taller than she was, a dense, pale forest in the center of the cavern. Tassels had formed, and the delicate, embryonic ears were beginning to swell within their green husks. The contrast between her subterranean world and the world outside was absolute. Inside was life, moisture, growth, stillness. Outside was death, dust, decay, and violence. Sometimes, she would hear the lowing of desperate cattle, a sound that would carry for miles in the thin, dry air, a lament for a world without water. The ranchers, men like Jedediah, were losing everything. Their herds were collapsing, dying of thirst and starvation on the barren range. The wells in Providence were failing one by one, the water drawn from them becoming brackish and foul. The town was slowly strangling. Martha felt a strange detachment from it all. The suffering was an abstraction, a story told by the wind and the dust. Her focus had narrowed to the 10-foot circle of her garden. It was a universe entire, demanding all her attention, all her care. She was the sole protector of this impossible harvest, a keeper of a green flame in a world turning to ash. It was a heavy, sacred responsibility. The survival of the town was not her concern. Her own survival, once a desperate scramble, now felt like a quiet, profound certainty, rooted as deeply as the corn in the dark, damp earth of the cave. The man appeared at dusk, a scarecrow silhouette against the blood-red sky. He staggered toward the cave mouth, lurching like a broken automaton. For a moment, Martha thought he was a phantom, an apparition conjured by the heat and the dust. But then Bo rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest, and she knew the figure was real. As he drew closer, she recognized him. It was Jedediah. The swaggering arrogance was gone, stripped from him along with the flesh from his bones. His face was a hollowed-out mask of desperation, his lips cracked and blackened. His clothes, once the proud attire of a prosperous rancher, were tattered and coated in a uniform layer of fine, brown dust. He did not see her at first, his eyes fixed on the dark opening of the cave as if it were a shrine. He fell to his knees a few feet from the entrance, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "Water," he rasped, the word a dry scrape in his throat. He clawed at the ground, his voice breaking. "Please, water." Martha remained in the shadows just inside the entrance, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. This was the man who had laughed at her. The man who had mocked her grief and her hope. The town's chorus of scorn, embodied in this one broken creature. A part of her, a dark and vengeful part, wanted to watch him suffer. It would be justice. It would be the world balancing its cruel ledgers. He coughed, a dry, racking spasm that shook his entire frame. He collapsed onto his side, his gaze falling into the cave's interior. His eyes, vacant with thirst, slowly widened. They passed over her and fixed on the impossible sight behind her, the tall, pale green stalks of corn, their leaves slick with moisture in the dim light. A look of utter, profound disbelief crossed his features, a confusion so deep it momentarily erased the pain. He had seen a ghost. He had seen a miracle. He tried to speak, but only a dry click came from his throat. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he lay still. The dilemma was sharp and immediate. Her water was finite, a slow, steady drip that sustained her and her crop. Her food was the result of months of backbreaking, solitary labor. It was hers, earned in silence and darkness. To share it was to risk her own carefully constructed survival. To withhold it was to become as merciless as the land that had broken this man. Bo looked up at her, whining softly, the growl gone from his throat. She looked down at the pathetic, dust-caked figure at her feet. It was not a choice. It was a test. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of her anger, she went to the basin, filled a dipper with the clear, cold water, and returned to kneel beside him. She forced a few drops of water between his cracked lips. He choked, then swallowed convulsively. She gave him more, a slow, steady trickle, until his breathing evened out. He remained unconscious, but the immediate crisis of his thirst had passed. She left him lying on the cool stone floor just inside the entrance and went to her garden. With a small knife, she carefully cut a single ear of corn from its stalk. It felt heavier than it should, a solid, living weight in her hand. She peeled back the pale husk. The kernels inside were not the bright yellow of field corn, but a translucent, pearly white, plump with moisture and sweetness. This was the first of her harvest. She had imagined this moment differently, as a solitary, triumphant meal. Instead, she was giving the first fruit of her labor to her tormentor. The irony was as sharp as the taste of dust. She roasted the ear over a small, smokeless fire made from dried mesquite roots, the heat bringing out a sweet, nutty aroma that filled the cavern. When Jedediah finally stirred, his eyes fluttering open, she was waiting. She held the roasted corn out to him. He stared at it, then at her, his eyes filled with a dazed, uncomprehending shame. He took it with a trembling hand and ate like a starving animal, the juice dribbling down his chin. He ate the whole ear, then looked at his empty hands as if he couldn't believe it had been real. He slept for most of the next day. When he was strong enough to stand, he walked, shuffling like an old man, to the edge of her garden. He stood there for a long time, silent, staring at the forest of pale stalks. He touched a leaf, his fingers tracing its shape as if to confirm its existence. "How?" he finally whispered, his voice still a raw rasp. She did not answer. She simply continued her work, clearing a small weed from the base of a stalk. The how did not matter. The fact of it was all that mattered. The next morning, he was ready to leave. He stood before her at the cave mouth, his head bowed. He started, then stopped, unable to find the words. He looked out at the blighted landscape, then back at her. The town, the wells are gone. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a statement of fact, a final, weary admission of the world's complete failure. She simply nodded. He turned and began the long walk back, his steps steadier now, his back straight. He didn't look back. She watched him go, a small figure shrinking against the vast, empty backdrop, and knew that her isolation was over. The world was coming. They came 3 days later, a small, somber procession led by Jedediah. Mr. Gable was with them, his face grim, along with 3 other men from the town, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. They stopped a respectful distance from the cave, their dusty presence an intrusion on the profound silence of the bluffs. Jedediah did not speak. He simply gestured toward the dark opening. Mr. Gable stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He peered into the gloom, his eyes struggling to adjust. Martha stood just inside, bow at her side, a silent, watchful guardian. Mr. Gable called out, his voice hesitant. Jedediah, he told us. He trailed off as his vision cleared. He saw it. The impossible green, the tall, pale stalks rising from the cave floor. His jaw went slack. He took another step inside, then another, as if drawn by a magnetic force. The other men followed, their hard, sun-cracked faces filled with a slowly dawning awe. They walked around the perimeter of the garden, their movement slow and reverent, like men entering a church. They looked at the intricate channel of shale bringing water, at the rich, dark soil, at the heavy ears of corn hanging from the stalks. They looked up at the shaft of light from the collapsed ceiling. They were witnessing a thing that should not be, a defiance of every law of their harsh reality. No one spoke. The only sound was the steady drip of the water in the deeper chamber. The scorn was gone, burned away by the drought and replaced by a humbling, painful respect. These men, who had measured worth in acres and head of cattle, were faced with a new kind of wealth, one they could not comprehend. Mr. Gable finally turned to her. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a deep and profound shame. "We were fools," he said, his voice low. "We laughed." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not a pathetic widow, but a woman of terrifying, quiet strength. "Anything you need from the store," he said, the offer a plea for forgiveness. "On my account." "For as long as it takes," she gave a single, small nod. Her victory needed no words. Her vindication was the rustle of the corn leaves, the scent of damp earth, the living, breathing proof of her labor. They left as quietly as they had come, their shoulders slumped, their certainty shattered. She was no longer the town pariah. She was its last, best hope. Standing at the mouth of her cave, the setting sun casting her long shadow across the cracked earth, Martha was no longer an exile. She was an anchor. She had bent the world to her will not through force, but through patience, through labor, through the quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. The cave was her fortress, her garden was her kingdom, and the future, once a terrifying void, was now a thing she would grow herself, one pale, sweet kernel at a time.